This is Bite Size Climate Tech, Season 2.
And today I have the CEO of Airhive together here with me, Rory.
Rory's mission is to grow Airhive towards its ambitious goal of achieving megaton-scale carbon removal by 2030. Before dedicating his efforts to the environmental cause, Rory worked in international development and security in countries including Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. His journey from public service to the forefront of climate technology exemplifies a commitment to the sustainability and a brighter, cleaner future for our planet. Let's dive into this conversation and learn more about Rory's vision and the groundbreaking work Airhive is doing.
I worked overseas for a number of years, and maybe before there was some of these big climate events in Europe and in North America, I had a few in the developing world, and I guess it became kind of tangible to me in how important climate impacts were already becoming in places that barely afford to have additional challenges, poverty, conflict, political instability. So that kind of sent me on a course away from what I was doing to what I'm doing now.
I think that's great that nowadays a lot of intelligent and passionate people like Rory is actually working in the climate tech space, and that's the reason why I want to do this podcast as well. The topic that we want to talk about today is carbon management.
I think there's a really interesting debate that needs to be had a bit more. Doing carbon removal is unavoidable. That's the language that the IPCC uses. Estimates are that we need somewhere between 7 and 12 gigatons a year by 2050, and a much higher number probably in the back half of the century, particularly if we overshoot 1.5 degrees and we need to go net negative, so beyond net zero, to actually reducing atmospheric CO2 concentrations. I think there's a question about what different types that we use, and our view is that direct air capture is going to be a crucial removals at large scale. Easy to measure, it doesn't use that many raw materials, it doesn't take up that much land. Storage is permanent and very robust against leakage and things like that. So there's this sort of conversation that keeps is happening about the energy intensity of DAC, and I think just to sort of put some numbers on it, we had, say, a gigaton by 2050 of direct air capture alone, which I think is a realistic number.
Yeah, so it's the 1 gigaton out of the 7 to 12 gigaton that you just mentioned.
Exactly, yeah. Maybe that we don't get to 7 to 12 by that point. Let's say that there's 1 gigaton, meaning that there's 1 billion tons of CO2 being removed every year by DAC facilities globally. And that means for energy consumption, that if we assume that we need about 1 megawatt hour per ton of that we do, that would be about 1,000 terawatt hours a year. To put in contrast, the current global electricity production is about 27,000 terawatt hours a year, and the Energy Transition Commission last year estimated that we'd need to grow that to about 90 to 120,000 terawatt hours a year by 2050 to meet the net zero economy. So if you think about it, for every gigaton that you add of DAC, you would be adding about 1% to that total electricity generation, assuming the Energy Transition Commission numbers are exclusive of any kind of engineered removals like direct air capture.
Actually, demystify the mystery here, where I think people think that DAC is energy intense. But if we dive into this number, even in today's number, it's less than 3%. And then if by 2050 we're hitting the goal of our estimated, then it's around 1%. It's actually not that much as what people think.
Yeah. And that is all of the transition, all of the sort of effort to get to net zero is going to be hard. But there's no reason to think that adding that small wedge of carbon removal, even through energy intensive processes like DAC, is somehow unreasonably burdensome on top of all of that wider effort to decarbonise. We need to decarbonise at scales, and that does require a big expansion of renewable energy capacity worldwide, and we also need to do some removals, and it will be single digit percentages, although may well rise further in the second half of the 20th century if we overshoot temperature targets because we haven't decarbonised quickly.
How would you explain this to an 8-year-old?
Imagine that powering the global energy system with clean energy is lighting up a city. To add all of that extra carbon removal through direct air capture that we need would be the equivalent of lighting a few street lights in one neighborhood in that city.
And also, on top of that, after you do that, the whole neighborhood becomes more beautiful. And that's the whole point why we're doing this direct air capture thing, because we want to clean up the air so then we have a beautiful planet to live on. The previous guest asked, what's the one thing that you know of in nature that's relevant to physics and science that you think can solve the climate, that you get inspired by to solve the climate crisis?
I think the natural regeneration of lost forests is the one that really stands out for me. I know that from a pure carbon perspective, it's multiples better than plantations in terms of how much carbon is stored, but you also have all of these fabulous biodiversity benefits, human health benefits. It's just an announcement yesterday that they'll be restoring hundreds of hectares of old Atlantic rainforest in Devon, which are these beautiful old wet rainforests, many composed of oak, that used to exist across Britain and Ireland, and which we've started to now really appreciate how important they were from a biodiversity perspective. But it's also the case that they have fantastic carbon sequestration potential. So being able to combine those two things together is, I think, hugely exciting. There's one, if you want to, you can plant trees, and often they exist in commercial plantations, but there's real issues with how much carbon they actually sequester. The other option that you have is to move sources of potential damage to trees, and by either just leaving a landscape alone or by seeding trees in some sort of strategic locations in that space, ecosystems will take the opportunity to regenerate themselves. And so you have new trees growing, you get all of the other things that come up. You have epiphytic ferns and other things that live on the trees, because trees, each individual tree is itself an amazing ecosystem. You then have lots of other sort of plant and animal life that comes back along with that. And if you manage it in a sort of correctly, you have not just all of that biodiversity benefit, but you have really excellent carbon benefits too.
Oh, that's great. So it's basically create the good condition for the whole ecosystem for...
And even local climate as well, so you can have a beneficial effect on the amount of water that you have in that local area. It can have a cooling effect. Their wet rainforests help counter things like wildfires, which are growing even in the northern latitudes. So the awesome power of not just individual trees, but of forests and kind of mixed forest and open landscape, both carbon and biodiversity is incredibly exciting.
I think that's a good place, and basically nature knows the best for us. Thank you so much, Rory.
Expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official position of ICEYE's Climate Tech. We thank our guests for sharing their insights and experiences, and we thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey. Until next time.